Welcome everyone to Art Laboratory Berlin. And this is our second of two online talks. This is Viral Geographies, which is part of the Under the Viral Shadow Networks in the Age of Technoscience and Infection series that we've been running here at Art Laboratory Berlin since August. And tonight we have Sybille Neumeyer and Karolina Żyniewicz, who are going to speak about their art projects connected with the pandemic and with viral infection. We want to give special thanks to the Hauptstadt Kulturfonds for funding Under the Viral Shadow, and for the Berlin Senate Office for Culture and Europe, who have also been supporting our year program here at Art Laboratory Berlin. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Tuğçe Erel. And
yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for a short introduction, and then just thanking to our sponsors. In March 2019, for a residency program of 1A Space, I was in Hong Kong with a group of artists. After we got off the plane and passed through the passport control, we went through the gates that our body temperatures were measured automatically. My immediate encounter of seeing masked people was not new, but also surprising, because it showed me that how it is easy to forget a pandemic so easily. But I guess because it was not my experience, it was easy to forget it, ignore it unintentionally. I was fortunate to see the first iteration of Contagious Cities, a touring exhibition project kicked off in Hong Kong. The introduction text to exhibition and infographics showing facts and the timeline of SARS-1 was informative. It helped me to remember, but I learned more as well. I was already told several times in dinners how citizens of Hong Kong were traumatized of the experience and how their daily life has changed since SARS-1. Afterwards, I visited the second part of the Contagious Cities in Berlin, which took place at the Naturkunde Museum, Natural History Museum, Berlin. The exhibition was at the end of summer 2019 that Sybille Neumeyer took us a journey to look at the histories of virology in the city and beyond. By then, I would not think that I would ask Sybille to revisit her research from the position of being in the middle of another pandemic. When we decided to expand our current program Under the Viral Shadow as a series of online talks, we would not think that we would be in the middle of the fourth wave of COVID-19. Here we are in 2021, approaching the end of the second year of the COVID pandemic with my colleagues at Art Laboratory Berlin. And we try to create an online and offline platform to think, explore, and share knowledge and experience under the viral shadow. Today's event, Viral Geographies, welcomes Karolina Żyniewicz and Sybille Neumeyer. And please let me introduce you first speaker today. Karolina Żyniewicz is an artist and researcher who is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Warsaw at a Nature Culture Transdisciplinary PhD program. She's graduated from Academy of Fine Arts in Łódź, Department of Visual Arts in 2009. Working in a laboratory, mostly at the University Institute for Genetics and Biotechnology at the University of Warsaw, Żyniewicz locates her work in the field of bioart, although she tries to avoid using this term. She sees her liminal activity as a situated knowledge production. She is mostly focused on life in its broad understanding, its biological and cultural meaning. Her projects have mostly conceptual, critical character. The main point of her PhD research is multi-level relations emerging during the realization of liminal projects. She tries to put her observations as an artist researcher, liminal being, in the context of science and technology studies, actor network theory by Brunello Tour, and feminist humanities. Karolina Żyniewicz has shown her work in solo and group exhibitions and attended artist residencies internationally. As a researcher, she presented in conferences and published her research in journals. Karolina Żyniewicz, who will talk about her work practice, how the coronavirus pandemic spread her practice and current project Under the Viral Shadow. And I quote, "It seems to be almost inappropriate still to discuss the topic of the pandemic and the coronavirus. Everybody is already tired of the topic and wants to forget a tiny agent, invisible to the naked eye, a virus, reminded us our interdependence, physicality, embodiment, and vulnerability. Like many scholars and artists, she had doubts about an immediate response to the coronavirus. During the pandemic, she was one of the participants for the Biofriction project, which gave her a chance to work with the sci-fi ethnography. Furthermore, attending to a regular viral culture bio art and society meetings inspired her to write a text titled Living in the Panopticon, Who What Is Watching You While You Think You Are Alone. Today, Karolina will also introduce her current biosociological experiments, Sign of the Times, based on collecting biological traces, memories, and individual stories, which will be analyzed and presented in the future projects. The screen is yours, Karolina. Thank you.
Thank you for the amazing introduction, Tuce, and for the invitation to participate in this event. Firstly, I will try to share my screen, hopefully with success. Can you see my screen in full version? Okay. So I decided to title my presentation "The Pandemic's Trajectory" because, as Tuce mentioned, what I've been doing during the pandemic, this is only a part of my experience, and the term trajectory is taken from the area of anthropology. And it was firstly dedicated to research about dying for deadly illnesses or really traumatic experiences. Then it was broadened to describing every period of life which is changing everything in our lifespan. And what is interesting about trajectory is that we can point pretty precisely the start of trajectory and the moment when it's over. And as you imagine, the pandemic is not a perfect example of trajectory because we are not over with the experience. But I realized that every wave of the pandemic was kind of a separate trajectory, at least for me, because it was different experience and I learned different things. So I decided to guide you shortly through my trajectory, mentioning also my interest in trajectories of others. And the first wave of the pandemic, I spent in Warsaw, and it was really the moment of panic and being surprised by the situation. So it was really important to be a part of something bigger and to be together with people. That's why this mentioned series of meetings titled Viral Culture, Bio Art and Society was, it happened to me, it came to me on time, let's say, and it was really inspiring and supporting series of events, and also the moment when the community, art and science community, transdisciplinary research community discussed a lot of really crucial issues for our practice. And it was also the moment when many artists confessed being paralyzed in creativity, including myself. I was really concerned about the situation, and I felt that it's even unethical to be busy with artistic production when people are dying around. And it was rather thinking about this security of myself, my family, everybody around. And so I've been thinking, what can I do? Maybe my practice is over because of the pandemic. And then the project Biofriction came to me again on time. And Biofriction was thought as a series of residencies happening in Rio. but the beginning of the pandemic forced organizers to move this initiative to virtual reality, and it was collaboration of a couple of institutions in Europe, including Cultivamos Cultura in Portugal, and Marta de Menezes was a person responsible for a residency organized by Cultivamos Cultura as a director of this institution. And the leader of our group, of our project, of our residency was Dalila Honorato. And I got invited by her together with Robertina Sobienic, Louise Mackenzie, and Isabel Burretti to reflect on the future of art curating, and also working of cultural institutions. So it was really refreshing to work on something really conceptually. And at the same moment, I find a new way of artistic production, which was additionally for the first time really collaborative in terms of collaboration with other artists, because I used to work with scientists on my own projects, but it was never like collaborating on artistic idea together with other artists. So it was really new experience, really brain feeding experience, and we were like meeting regularly, writing a story together. We published the story, by the way, in Technoethic Arts journal pretty recently. But the most important output was this video, which you can see the frame on my screen. Staying in touch post-coronavirus art curating. So we translated our written stories somehow into a visual narration. And you can find the video on the internet. I encourage you strongly to check. And it was really refreshing because I was not myself fully in this project. I mean, of course, I gave to that my character, my artistic sensitivity, but my character was named K130, and I was like kind of hybrid, which is like improved by genetical modification. So I could imagine myself as a product of my own art, let's say. Here you can see a couple of frames from the video, and as you can see, the visuality of them was different because we were different, but the output was really balanced, and it was surprising even for us that we are working so nicely together. And the final point was the common exhibition happened. It happened in Lisbon in a new exhibition space run by Marta de Menezes. And it was actually also my first longer international travel after the first confinement. So it was a big thing, not only because of the event by itself, but also that it was like a complication with organizing the travel. And here I will move to the second, third, and fourth waves, because the location, my location has changed, and it happened between the first wave and the second wave, more or less in summer, because we have always these, let's say, windows of freedom happening in summer. So I moved to Berlin. One could say it was not the best moment to move abroad, but actually being in confinement in two different cities was not so different, because it was staying at home and being connected virtually. But what was different in the second wave, comparing with the first one, in my approach to my creativity, was that I was kind of ready to reflect on the situation, and I started to think how I can build a story, my artistic and research story on the situation, how to maybe capture what is the most important element of that, or elements of that, and how to keep them for the future. Because my feeling was, it was really spontaneous that I need to capture the situation somehow. And the first thing coming to my mind was like the most symptomatic element of our pandemic reality, namely masks. And I remember it was spring 2021 when I realized that streets in Berlin are full of masks. And I started to think about them not only as something protective, something like a cover of our face, but also as a sign of the times, in that sense that if we will imagine historical documents in the future about this period, we will see probably recordings, video recordings, photos of people wearing masks. On the other side, it was interesting as a waste, because we produced a lot of plastic waste to protect ourselves against the virus. And I heard also an announcement in a radio, I remember, that we should be really aware and careful when we are throwing the mask away, because people cleaning streets are at risk, because we knew that the virus is able to survive on the surface for a couple of hours. So they were not protected, because if they had contact with the mask like a few minutes after someone dropped it and the owner of the mask was infected, the virus could be possibly still on the surface. And it was the same about me collecting these masks from the street, because it was the feeling of being in touch with something objectual, because yeah, it was dirty, it was probably contaminated, maybe not only because of the virus, but because of our natural, let's say, biological collaborators, which they are coming from our body when we are talking, breathing, etc. So it was also interesting that the activity was adjusted to my regular practice. I used to work with borders, with rejected matter, and with objects. So this collection of masks was pretty typical for my activity. And then I found a way of building the collection, as you can see in this slide. I placed these masks in biological laboratory tubes, and of course this is always a risk of contamination by the outside environment. So these samples are, there is always a risk of contamination, if not contamination by the virus, also the contamination in terms of cleanness of the sample. So it can be something coming from the room where I stored the mask. And then I realized that collecting masks is not enough. I got really curious of people being behind these masks, and of stories, personal trajectories of people. And I decided to move forward with the project and to transform it into partly sociological, maybe psychological, also in some part experiment. And my idea was to organize meetings in person. When I started to do that, it was possible because it was summer. So again, the window of freedom. And the first episode happened in Berlin in August in Liebig 19. And that was a kind of rehearsal of this meeting. I was like trying to figure out how to organize the situation, how to make people comfortable in talking about even personal stories. And I collected a couple of recordings and a couple of samples, and the process of collecting was really simple. Namely, the participant, was deciding about the story to tell. I was not asking questions. It was not a regular interview. So the person was asked to sit in front of the camera, and I gave to the person a fresh medical mask to wear during talking. While the person was talking, it was like embedding the everything what is coming from the breath and from our mouth and from our nose when we are talking. So it was imagining, okay, this is the moment when some biological matter is coming to the surface of the mask. And it was collecting these biological traces only during the process of talking. Then the person was asked to give me the mask to add it to the existing collection. So it's from the one side, I have these biological traces to examine possibly in 2 years, 3 years, hopefully from the time perspective, and I perceive it as a possible historical material to present when we will have totally different circumstances. And I continue doing the project. And the second episode happened in Poland, in my favorite and beloved gallery, Łaźnia in Gdańsk, and especially there I met people telling me really intimate personal stories, really sad stories sometimes. Maybe it was because we got this connection because I am from Poland, so we feel this understanding of the situation which they were describing to me. And every meeting is different, every story is different. I feel really grateful to people to share these stories with me, and I'm really curious how it of differences in different spots in different places in Europe, because Europe is the only area right now available for me to organize a meeting in person. And the last episode happened again in Berlin very recently, in November, at TOP, Transdisciplinary Project Space, and it happened actually thanks to Tuche. She helped me to organize it, and it was really unfortunate moment, I would say, because that was the moment when the situation with the pandemic in Berlin started to be complicated again. So people, I suppose that nobody would be eager to come to the gallery to take a risk to leave home just to participate in something like that. But I collected again a couple of meaningful samples and stories. So it's always the situation of meeting not a big group of people, but always it's unusual and worth of continuing. And hopefully the next step will be Sweden. I got invited to Malmo, and possibly the event will happen in January if I will be able to travel to Sweden. And I am open, of course, to visit other places if someone would feel that this is something to invite to the gallery or another space, because it can happen in many different places, not necessarily in galleries or places dedicated to art. So yes, I think that would be everything from my side at this moment. I'm really curious of Sybille's presentation, so I will stop here, giving the floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina, for your wonderful presentation and sharing your experience throughout the corona pandemic. Next, I would like to introduce our second speaker. Sybille Neumeyer is an interdependent artist with focus on modern human ecologies and environmental issues. Her projects are based on collaborations and dialogues with a diversity of knowledge holders. Sybille is voicing non-human agencies and amplifying muted subjects while investigating the correlations of biocultural diversity loss, climate crisis, and planetary health through works in different media, installations, and participatory formats. Her projects are supported by institutions and an artist residency such as Academy Schloss Solitude, HIAP Arcus Project, Wellcome Trust, ZKM, IASS Potsdam, amongst others, and her works shown on international exhibitions. Sybille is a member of interdisciplinary research collectives such as Textiles and Collection Ecologies. And currently, she is a fellow at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Netherlands. Sybille Neumeyer will reflect on voicing encounters, a narrative cartography of virus developed in a dialogue with experts and scientists for KOEXISTENZ, Museum for the Natural History of Nature's Museum in Berlin. It's so weird. Naturkunde Museum is so easy to say. English is difficult to say. So this exhibition took place at the end of in the middle of 2019 as part of the Contagious Cities by Wellcome Trust. The artistic vogue combines collective reading, nonlinear narration, and psychogeographic explorations of the city, introducing the concept of polyphonic storytelling. The artist phantoms transformative narratives, anticipatory memory, and speculative worlding. The nonlinear mapping of events and symbiosis, interdependencies, contact zones, and coexistence throws an ecological perspective on viruses and troubles dominant paradigms of pathogens and pandemics. By amplifying the perspectives of oppressed minorities, muted in Western historiographies, as well as by tracing the agency of non-humans in pandemic events, the participants were invited to a critical reading and nuanced reflections of historical, cultural, medical, and social events, which his stories leak into features. Who is narrating, and what remains untold? How far does our memory echo? Who is we, and where does a map end? Sybille, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Tuce. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here tonight with colleagues, friends, and collaborators, Karolina and Tuce. I will try to share my screen. So please let me know if it works well for you. Yes? Perfect. So I take the occasion today to reflect on my project, Voicing Encounters, a narrative cartography of virus, which I developed in 2019, as mentioned by Tuce already in her introduction, as part of the international cultural program, Contagious Cities, by Wellcome Trust. Contagious Cities was initiated to bring different disciplines together to understand how microbes and viruses shape cities, infrastructures, and communities, and to support local conversations around the global challenges of epidemic preparedness. It took place in Hong Kong, Geneva, New York, and Berlin over a period of 1 year. Combining different perspectives and expertise, partners in the program co-produced artist residencies, exhibitions, interactive experiences, events, and broadcasts. Together, we investigated the physical, social, economic, and cultural effects of infectious diseases. The program in Berlin had the focus of coexistence and was hosted by the Museum für Naturkunde Berlin, the Natural History Museum in Berlin, with the aim to initiate the new debates around coexistence of humans, animals, and viruses. The program marked the centenary of the 1918 flu pandemic, during which a third of the world's population was infected and around 50 million to supposed 100 million people died. The gray zone of 50 million deaths stroked me. Which numbers are we able to remember, and how were these people counted? And why were some of them not counted? Why didn't they count in early historiography? I thus took this historical event as a starting point for my investigation in how the past and the memory of the past has shaped and still shapes our relationship between humans, animals, and viruses, and our relationships amongst each other. The project on polyphonic coexistences, on the city as a contact and conflict zone, on liminal characters and forms of anticipatory memory, as well as social cultural immunities, consisted of 3 parts: the artistic walk around the museum's periphery, a map that served as a base for it. This map is based on visuals of early medical geography, but rather contains vectors of stories than vectors of contagion. A third component of the project is a compilation of composed field recordings that were developed in collaboration with sound artist Till Boverman. Let's start with listening. Resonance Fields, track number 8, is called Who We Care For. It follows the creek Südpanke in its flowing direction. The ecology is above water and those submerged. The creek is home to multiple life forms, plastic pieces and pollutants, while it also hosts algae that breathe for us and plants that filter the water. It is embedded in a park environment that allows Berlin inhabitants to rest and regenerate after work and on weekends. For our field recordings, we collected and examined the layers of technophony, biophony, geophony, and anthropophony of the city's soundscapes and experimented with amplifications of voices, potential non-human spheres of hearing, and the coexistences of sounds, voices, and noises. As we eavesdropped the creak of Panke, hearkened the bark of a beech tree, and immersed in the sonic oscillations underneath the road bridge, the polyphony of entities in Berlin often revealed to be a cacophony in constant negotiation between humans, animals, and technologies. The sound pieces, wonderfully composed by Till, invite to notice what is around us, not only as a passive backdrop, but as an assembly of entities on all scales, constantly shaping and reshaping the shared environment. A myriad of voices, always in dialogue or in conflict, moments of merging, overlapping, muting each other. Some of you might have noticed in 2020, the COVID-19 lockdown silenced the noise of the civilization. Traffic, airplanes, construction sites, and industrial noises. All these sounds were paused and brought the biophony again to the foreground. It was very interesting for me to see the impact of the absence of the human and technological noises on the well-being of multiple species, and the positive and healing effect of the bird songs on human well-being in times of crisis. How can we notice each other and others better? What are we able to hear if we pause ourselves? We begins with noticing. We begins with listening. All the sounds can be found and listened on SoundCloud. I recommend your headphones for full immersion. I further developed an artistic walk that drew attention to microbial and viral agencies, not only in cities, but also highlighted their ecological, evolutionary, social and political entanglements, while tracing histories of the influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 and the development of virology, microbiology, and modern concepts of health. The cityscape in Berlin Mitte, its architectures, construction sites, infrastructures, bodies of water, and public sites served here as a storyboard for a non-linear walking and non-linear storytelling exercise that combined collective reading and psychogeographic explorations. The concept for the walk is based on a cross-species investigation. Different agents are telling stories which bring to the fore the diversity of being in and becoming with each other in the world. Events were put in relations to sites and peculiarities of Berlin, and at times even allowed us to travel far in distance of time and space. Facts, fictions, concepts and questions about pandemics and virology were gathered as microstories beyond narratives of heroes and enemies, which are often found in modern microbiology, beyond the idea of humans mastering the environment and paradigms of nature-culture divides. I intentionally did not follow a linear history of contagion, but traced the multi-species and interwoven history of microbes and viruses, searching for the different layers and peripheries of events, enabled both living and inanimate actors to claim their authorships, and called for muted and marginalized narrators to become amplified voices. This exercise in polyphonic narration served as a method to break through a purely anthropocentric perspective on the past, and it invited reflections on coexistence and called for remembering the histories as excluded from Western textbooks. As you here see on the picture, we squeezed together on a small platform above the canal. We flipped through the rising numbers of Berlin's population in the 2 last centuries, while gazing down the muddy waters that once might have dispersed the waters towards the outskirts. James Hobrecht's sewage system, like many other canals and water infrastructures, has influenced urban waste metabolisms and embodied concepts of contagion and performed dispersal of infections and knowledge hierarchies. As we meandered along monuments of highlighted figures in Western history, we considered not only the absence of monuments for female and Jewish scientists, but further traced the absence of alternate forms of medical knowledge, of alternate concepts of health. As we shook hands in the hospital of Charité, we recalled the troubles of Austrian physician Ignaz Semmelweis to introduce simple hygienic measures like washing the hands in 1847, which he had observed and learned from the midwives working in his hospital, a measure that was rejected by his male colleagues, a measure that would have prevented the death of many mothers and babies in that time. As we leaned on the ventilated walls of the Virology Institute and were surrounded by humming sounds of machines, fridges, and devices, we pondered about the visibility of phenomena and the lenses and technologies required to understand the world beyond our scales of perception. While these devices are crucial to medical imaginaries, they created scientific objects rather than allowing us to engage with non-human subjects and draw us away from the focus from ecological correlations and push us towards a thinking in disciplinary frames, in linear and singular causalities, and in monological etiologies, and therefore distracting us from seeing the bigger picture of disease and health, such as the impact of monocultures on the spread of diseases in plants and animals. As the group splitted on the mural memorial of the Berlin Wall, we examined notions of self and other, notions of inside and outside, and of social, political, and cultural repercussions of walls. We also visited the graveyard. Here I don't show pictures because of ethical reasons. As the end of World War I overlapped with the Spanish flu, and we noticed the absence of memorials for the latter between the celebrations of heroes for the former, As we count the death casualties of World War I and calculate the accumulations of losses in the influenza pandemic, we get lost in abstract numbers and the gaps in data and scrutinize the graveyards, engravings for microhistories and stories that might help us to remember. As we stood in front of the Medical History Museum of Berlin, which hosts hundreds of dry and wet specimens of human tissues, we read about the historically romanticized diseases, such as tuberculosis, and we learned about co-infections of influenza patients with bacterial pneumonia. And as we paid attention to the fragilities and functions of the lungs in our bodies, we were grateful for the trees around us to breathe for us. Along the way through Berlin's districts of ministries, we considered the roles of surveillance and operational images that shape and manipulate ideas of safety and public health. As we passed the blocks of pharmaceutical industries of Berlin, we situated ourselves in a health system that has been built on the expenses of others, of humans and non-humans, creating structures and inequities that still exist today. As we speculated about the possible futures of our planet, we traveled back in deep times when microbial agencies not only shaped the Earth's atmosphere and thus enabled oxygen-breathing life forms, also deep times when symbiotic relationships of unicellular organisms formed the basis of all life as we know it today. We also encountered the evolutionary step triggered by a retrovirus, whose infection of an egg-laying critter resulted in the formation of mammals. How can we acknowledge microbes and viruses as our ancestors? Further stations brought us to military areas and to far distant places like Samoa or the settlements of Inuits in colonial times. So I won't be able to tell all the stories today in this short introduction. But for the participants, the reading seems on a first glimpse fragmented and puzzled together and in non-chronological orders. But likewise, the trajectories of the influenza virus, as well as the knowledge, the narratives, and imaginaries of viruses had surfaced in our scientific understanding, often in unexpected and non-linear ways. So I took the past wave of viruses in our histories as an inspiration. Microbes as carriers of genes and viruses as fragmented puzzle pieces help us to understand the relevance of acknowledging the past as a dynamic and as continuing in the present, co-shaping our futures. The exercises in voicing functioned as an act of revealing agency of various organisms and matters, and thus as an attempt to disrupt a purely anthropocentric perspective on our world. Further, these invisible agents make visible the gaps and blind spots on the maps of memory and call for creating other maps with inscriptions of biocultural diversity, inscriptions that might help us to navigate in uncertain futures. We have to heal the way of writing and telling histories as a polyphonic activity together with many other authors, to create a pool of knowledge that helps us not only to be prepared, but also to prevent events that threaten a planetary coexistence. The walk was developed through conversations and discussions with scientists and experts from the Museum für Naturkunde, the Virology Institute of the Charité, the Berlin Medical History Museum, the Robert Koch Institute, and the Wellcome Trust. I especially thank Peter Bartsch, Till Bovermann, Christian Drosten, Silke Franert, Ansgar Greshake, Linus Günther, Terry Jones, Frieda Meyer, Barbara Mühlemann, Tahani Nadim, Simon Ripberger, Wiebke Rössig, Thomas Schnalke, Jori Scholka, Lara Spinney, Tali White, and Lucifer Beek for support and sharing their expertise. Or in short, to end and to begin with a quote by Scott Gilbert, "We have never been individual." Just to finish my presentation, I want to say in March 2020, the scheduled walks of voicing encounters were cancelled as the pandemic of COVID-19 unfolded and the first lockdown measures were introduced. A format that brought people together in the public to discuss about public health and to learn from historical events was suddenly a potential risk of infection. Our relationship to public space and intimacy with each other in shared spaces has drastically changed within weeks and still does. Today, in this panel discussion, I want to take the chance to engage in questions of memory and archiving. And I'm quite excited to talk with you now, Karolina, about these questions. Thank you.
Sybille, for giving us a beautiful introduction to your project, which is we only scratched the surface of the whole project, but thank you for giving this like a insight and then just revisit your research from 2019, but in this point of view where we are standing. And then I am looking forward to having our little discussion, and Karolina is also now here with us, three together, and then also with the questions that we will have from our YouTube chat. We hope to have this like a really vibrant conversation. And as I mentioned, this is just an excavation, and we have heard different ways of how to excavate the surface of today's and then past history, often untold stories of individuals. And then I really like the way that you finished your sentence, your presentation, that we had never been individuals. And then I was also thinking how you two, both of you, collected your stories from present, but also try to just retreat what has been hidden. So, Karolina, I would like to first address this question to you. How is it also personally to have these encounters with the stories that you were collecting with this project?
This is a really nice question, and I think this is the most important thing in my activity in this project which I presented, because it's always surprising because it's not only the story taken from the period of the pandemic. It's usually a story built on like history of life of someone. It's like, you know, the experience of the pandemic is related to how the person is able to deal with that, and the way how to deal with that is the result of many previous experiences. So first of all, yeah, this is like 10 minutes, 15 minutes of talking, but the style of talking and also the selection of the story is telling me a lot about the person. As I said, I didn't expect to listen to such a emotional sharing, and sometimes this is also an evidence of failures or in the system. And when I sit in front of the person telling the story, because at some moment, my friend Margarita actually during the first meeting suggested me that it's more comfy to her to have me in front of her instead of talking to the camera. And this is another element of eyes contact. And I feel strongly the energy of the person, and also sometimes it's like maybe not feeling responsibility for the story and for helping the person, because as I said in my presentation, I don't have skills and I don't have professional tools to for instance help in problems with depression or something like that. But what is important is this gathering in person, first of all, because after so long time of the confinement, it was important for me to have it in a traditional form, because probably talking virtually wouldn't be so strong in terms of energy exchange, and yeah, and also the behavior of the person talking would be probably different, because I discovered, for instance, totally by the way, that talking to the camera is somehow hard for many people, and it was really surprising after so long time of working virtually and talking to the computer camera that someone is like ashamed or maybe a little bit nervous in the situation of talking to the regular camera. So it's a lot of discovering of different people behaviors. And as I said about this digging a little bit deeper, probably if I would have more time and the formula of my project would be more open for talking for longer, I would discover much more interesting stories, because I also realized that this is important for people to have a space, a safe space, to tell their stories without judgment, without this typical informations about the pandemic, because we used to hear information about the number of cases of, the number of infections, the daily number of deaths, and this is something which is really neutral at some moment, because we are let's say, maybe we got used to that, which is not necessarily good. So I decided to be focused on these personal stories, personal trajectories, because this is something missing from my perspective in the general discourse. So that's why my plan is to collect them and to show them at some moment, maybe also for these people participating in the project. It will be something like getting back and seeing their story from different perspectives. Maybe someone would say, "Ah, yes, I remember the time it was really difficult, but right now I am much better," or something similar to that. So I really appreciate the project done by Sybille, because this is like connecting the general key story, the key story of science, the key story of the city, with also non-human participants. In my project, they are also important. And I hope they were collaborating in telling the stories. So as I said, it was the moment when they maybe got freedom for a moment to go to the mask surface. So, and I would mention here also, probably it can be useful for the further discussion, the notion which I found recently really inspiring, which is taken from Anna Tsink's writing about its contamination as collaboration. And when I heard about your approach, Sybille, and this listening to non-human agents, it came to my mind immediately that we maybe could think a little bit deeper about this notion in the context of the pandemic, because if I could remember, she wrote the book in 2015, so we have a totally different situation right now, and probably the interpretation of this theoretical proposal is also different.
Thank you, Karolina. And then actually a similar question, but a different perspective. I want to address it to you, Sybille, that actually when you were looking at your project and when you were making the research for this project, we can say, I think there's two elements. There's this one aspect that you were collecting information and doing interviews with the scientists who are working in the area of virology, or people who are interested around this research. But then you are looking back, the maps of viral maps. I think it's a good way of describing. Maybe you can just tell us how suddenly fiction also became a tool to address the stories of untold and minority and then muted people when you were doing this research. You're muted.
Of course. Thank you for the question, but also thank you, Karolina, for your comments just before. And I think just before I answer my question, I think this notion of contamination is really interesting, as Anna Tsing describes it also in her book, because the contamination that hinders or invites the tree and the mushroom to collaborate is actually contamination caused by humans. So it's also kind of twisting this agency of contamination and who's contaminated by whom and who's then collaborated in reaction to what. And I think, we can take this book definitely as an inspiration, and her writing and thinking has inspired my work as well. So I'm really happy that you mentioned that. And now coming back to your question, Tuğçe, I mean, like I've been intensely trying to gather stories from different knowledge holders in different disciplines. First, one reason was that this gray zone of 50 to 100 million deaths from the pandemic actually was a constant adjustment of the numbers in the history books and textbooks, that only recently, through collaboration and disciplinary collaborations or cross-disciplinary collaborations, these numbers were updated. And these numbers then not only were taken from statistics, but also from the work of sociologists or of journalists that addressed the question, how was the influence of pandemic happening in countries that were not in focus of European storytelling and historytelling? What happened in Africa? What happened in Russia? What happened in different countries? And through the work with, for example, diaries or other archival materials, more casualties have been able to be traced. And it's still an ongoing process of trying to understand what happened back then, and what was recorded and how. So also this question of how things have been recorded was really important for me. And I think that's also something that you, Karolina, addressing so well, that, we need different tools and devices to collect memories besides, abstractions and statistics. And also to consider how these filter then what is collected and what is memorized, beside objective knowledge, what emotions are relevant to make us aware of how we encounter unexpected events and how we are relating to each other and to our environment. And the role of mapping has played in these statistics quite a role. No, this sentence did not make sense. The role of these maps was quite important for creating these statistics, and also, tracing trajectories of contagion. And in the same time, maps, of course, are coming from a military background, from processes of claiming territories, of narratives of nations and borders. So they themselves are in themselves so complicated and troubling. And so I was wondering about the agency and the history of medical, of medicine, and which power relations that they then again, recreate. And I found one map also showing a big part of Russia saying no data, keine Angaben, which again echoed in me this moment of the maps are always exclusive. They show something and they exclude a lot of other things, and that they are constrained in their territories. And then, it's also the scale in them does not allow us to, zoom in or zoom out, and to think also in relationships between events in distant places of this planet. So I tried to mirror their aesthetics, but in the same time, I made a map that maybe invites us to get lost and to not follow a linear way, but rather become curious about places and potential relationships to something that is not on the map. So the multiple errors that you would find on that map would then always address something somewhere else. So even we would walk around in Berlin, Berlin's history is also deeply entangled with events in other places and even other potential futures. So that was my approach to work with and in the same time against a method of mapping. Yeah.
No, I really find this discussion very important and valuable in a personal level, who is trained as a sociologist and then who decided not to practice sociology just because of this like a very rigid, reductionist, number-based analysis. Sometimes it depends, of course, from which direction that you're approaching for research, sociological research. But there's also is an interesting opportunity when you include this artistic research that allows you to just bring minor stories of an untold, muted communities as you address, Sybille. And then therefore, I find it really interesting that you both in dialogue in this conversation, because you are bringing different ways of storytelling of individuals that are not necessarily using scientific or social scientific research methodologies. It has partial in that sense, because I mean, well, Karolina, you're also a PhD candidate. Probably you have been forced to just follow certain regulations, how to just continue with your research. But at the same time, this artistic research allows a certain platform to just twist or just like go beyond those kind of methodologies that I think it's really important sometimes to bring it to a discussion. Because working with numbers, working with data is crucial, but at the same time it is dangerous, because with the same data you can tell completely two different stories. But then what kind of story that you want to bring is a subjective decision, not an objective anymore. So we have a question from Chris that I would like to quickly read here, then we can continue the conversation. A virus, being the influenza in 1918 or SARS-CoV-2 today, is invisible, undead, silent. Yet, as a species, we found ourselves trying to grapple with the invisible half-being. Yet we do so through social means, debate, negotiation, attempts at consensus. Yet the virus doesn't negotiate, it's only purposes. So it's not a question, but it's more like a comment. So I just read it out loud to share.
I think he. Sorry for interrupting. I think the message by Chris was interrupted. It says like the virus doesn't negotiate. Its only purpose is replication. Are our social means self-defeating because we? I think we are reading first and then he's typing. Are our social means self-defeating because we are negotiating with ourselves? That's a beautiful comment and question, I would say. That let us wait until he's finished.
Yeah, this is a long comment.
Yeah, I was not expecting. Maybe I thought that it was finished. Sorry. Maybe we can just continue and then just like a.
Yeah, but if I may just jump in for a second, because what appeared in the first section of Chris's comment is about this invisibility of the virus and its presence in our discourse and in our experiences, mostly when we are sick. So that was a main inspiration for my text, which you mentioned, Tuce, about living in Panopticon, because I felt that we are observed kind of course, by the virus. Of course, the virus is even not an organism, so it doesn't have the option of observing us, but it was just like a metaphor that we are all the time in stress that the virus is around, but we never know where is it and who is infected, who is sick. We can test ourselves, of course, and right now we are vaccinated, but this is still the feeling that the virus is around. And we observe also each other really strongly. If the person around, these people around, they, for instance, follow rules because we want to be safe. So it's always this narration is built on kind of believing that the virus exists. Of course, science is a story which is really seriously written. But in the end of the day, for in our daily basis, this is believing in science. Let's say it's like, yeah, I wouldn't say that this is a new religion, but in case of the pandemic, I felt something like that. Yeah, I trust science. Of course, we have also people being anti-vaxxers and people not believing in the pandemic at all. So maybe the reason is that the virus is invisible. So just like a comment to Chris's comment.
Yeah, I would also add to that that, yeah, I mean, like this concept of it being not alive is maybe also interesting to be examined under the lens of talking from a Western perspective, and that we potentially could also invite ourselves to think with like its agency and like role in the world as a being, and actually also relating to the point of invisibility. Of course, we notice the viruses when they infect organisms, humans and non-humans as well. And then we acknowledge them being there, but actually we are constantly surrounded by trillions of viruses floating around us, attached to all surfaces. We also have the same with the microorganisms and microbes that we now are also acknowledged that our body contains more microbial cells than human cells, which is also, of course, not visible for the human eye. But then science allows us to see and acknowledge that and to understand this symbiotic relationships. And we still don't have real symbiotic, or we might have, actually, we have symbiotic relationships with viruses as well, but not in a sense that we can immediately read them or appreciate them, but people are living with retroviruses is of course a relationship that is leading to death, but then also thinking about how viruses were the cause of the evolutionary step to become mammals was for me kind of a changing moment in my perception of the agency. And I think the narration of microbes and viruses only as enemies is not helpful for acknowledging other life forms or other beings and entities in this world to have their role and to play their role, and viruses are able to regulate the ecosystems and therefore do a really valuable ecosystem service for our environment, which then also would influence, for example, the carbon cycles of the ocean. There's a lot of publications on these correlations as well, and I think we have to think about invisibility and means of perception, but then also invisibility of different of the multiplicity of viruses and microbes and their different relationalities. So we have to maybe unlearn also to think very linear about these forms of beings and non-beings, and even maybe also about our binary thinking between life and death. Yeah.
Before I go to another question by Regina, actually, I just remember before our conversation, we had this like an internal discussion. And I remember, Sybille, you were also telling us that you have been collecting in the beginning of this pandemic. The isolation also pushed you to collect. And then when you were also finishing your presentation, that you wanted to look through this lenses of archiving. So what were you archiving in the beginning?
Yeah, this is, I wanted to even add it to my presentation, because I realized that not only Sybille was like spontaneously collected what she's going to say, she was collected, but I also met a person, a colleague of mine, who told me about collecting recordings of brief of people which he met in person. So I was like, oh my God, so many people at the same time got the idea to collect something like material traces from the time. So yeah. Sybille, tell us, what is that?
Yeah, this is a nice coincidence, Karolina, because the colleague that you mentioned is also my collaborator, Samuel Diaz, that we worked for a co-creation for a sound project that he presented this collection of breathings, this intimacy about the situation during the pandemic times. So yes, Sybille, yeah, we're curious. We know that.
I just showed a few of them. So when the pandemic started, everyone knows that the hand washing became suddenly so important measure to prevent infection and contagion. So I started collecting these bits and pieces of soap whenever they were finished or almost finished, and I also got some of colleagues and friends. And they made me think a lot in the beginning about disappearance and about absence and about time passing. And I think we all remember the first lockdown, how we had suddenly a different relationship to time as well, and how our days were structured and what rituals and repetitions were included in these daily lives. So I started collecting these tiny bits of soap, and I thanks to our conversation, I started resuming that. So if any one of you or the listeners in the audience out there wants to submit a piece of soap almost finished, I would be grateful for
they
that.
Are amazing sculptures because they have different shapes, and they are also memories of the hand movement. So it's amazing from many different reasons.
Yeah, I think so as well. I thought of them of kind of sculptures, actually, small sculptures. Not so much to talk about stories or, but more of these kind of, forming something with the hand, non-intentionally, but then still doing it. And as a sculpture of time and, maybe also of these embodied emotions but not spoken.
I would like to read out Regina's question that she put it on YouTube chat. Thank you both for impressive viral geographical storytelling, putting the virus in the center of debate. Humans disappear as co-actors, as respondents. What about paths could we go to stress the viral subjectivity? Maybe learning from the quickly developed SARS-CoV-2 mutants and variants in 2021. Both talks reveal and visualize so many aspects: mask to protect the human, maps to reveal human, and Western question mark traces. At the same time, it is interesting what is not revealed and not visualized. What and who stays behind? What and who does not have access to masks and therefore is not able to spontaneously protect oneself against the virus? What past traces and ways are not mapped?
Yeah, very important question. I mean, that is
and complex.
Yeah, the conflict, actually. I think that's the conflict that I tried to grapple in my project as well, because when I started, I mean, I had the privilege back then to look at something that was 100 years back in time. But actually, I mean, like the whole structures that I encountered during my research and all these, problematic aspects of pandemics, including, notions of borders, xenophobia, privilege, exclusion, and inequities still seem to be ongoing. And when I started collecting the stories for my storytelling, I kind of could hardly make a stop, because the more I gathered, the more I realized what is not included, and it became a vicious circle somehow of, with every voice I tried to include, I was aware that other voices would not be included. So in the end, I had to follow a more meandering way, and trying not to be not to create a kind of these these forms of textbooks that always promise us to tell the whole history and create a fiction of everything we should know is told, but rather created different walks that would be each time different ways, different narratives, and to allow sometimes stories to surface and sometimes other stories to be in the focus. And I think in the best case, this project would be just ongoing and invite many people that would bring in their own stories. And maybe that's something where Karolina and I could collaborate at some point, just to highlight the urgency of not writing histories as a fixed status quo, but rather creating formats and events where we gather and we exchange about what we know and how we know it, and reflect on how we can use this knowledge as something that creates communities. Yeah, so that's my comment.
I think a few things is coming to my mind, because first of all, I remember from these meetings of viral culture group that we were discussing this diversity of societies, in that sense that we were like complaining that we are in confinement, we have to stay home. Meanwhile, a lot of people was like homeless and nobody was caring about them. Probably nobody even considered that they are around, and nobody asks question, maybe we should provide masks to them, because that was the feeling that they are yeah, they are so meaningless that we shouldn't be bothered by the situation. So this differences between different levels of society, let's say, I think in the time of the pandemic started to be even more visible. And another thing which is coming to my mind is that just before the pandemic started, I spent pretty long time in Mexico City. And I saw the lifestyle of majority of society there. And a lot of people being really poor and living, I mean, not maybe living in the street, but selling food, for instance, in the street. And when the first lockdown started, immediately came to my mind that, oh my God, how the government is going to deal with the problem in Mexico City, because they can't stop these people from providing food to their families. This is the only chance for them to survive. So I started to search on the internet how the situation is there and how they deal with restrictions, because it's really hard to follow restrictions if you have more serious existential problems in the sense that you don't have food, you don't have place to stay. So it's not then thinking about masks, being vaccinated or not, it's just trying to survive. So we should remember that our perspective, if we are like middle class, let's say Western citizens, is different than people living, first of all, outside Europe in different areas, for instance, with war problems, because I believe there the pandemic is like secondary problem. They have like, yeah, war is it's obvious that this is the biggest danger for life. So yeah, definitely we should be more maybe focused on thinking not about ourselves, because I think the pandemic happened also in the moment when capitalism was really like developed, and we started to be really focused on our own career, on our or on developing ourselves, because that was the passion or in psychology even, that yeah, be focused on yourself, improve yourself. This is not important what is happening around. Meanwhile, in the situation of the crisis as pandemic is, it's important to think collaboratively, in that sense that we need to be responsible not only for ourselves, we need to think about other people around. So this is a big test for our social behaviors and our social sensitivity, I would say. And just getting back for a second to the virus, as this let's say the center of the pandemic, I think that the situation now is quite testing the notion of contamination as collaboration, because I believe that for majority of us, we are not collaborating with the virus. I think about contamination as infection in this case. We rather think that we are fighting with the virus. So this is totally against this thinking, new materialist thinking that we are together, we are becoming together, we are not individual. This is testing these theoretical concepts from my perspective. So probably the virus collaborates with us, with our body, because it needs us to survive. But from our anthropocentric perspective, this is like enemy. We don't need it. Even though this is an evolutionary process that we will have new mutations of certain viruses, certain bacteria, and we will probably have a lot of different viruses coming, and we are not sure if they won't be more harmful than coronavirus. So yeah, this is really challenging to think about being with non-human agents, I would say. It's challenging even to think about being with other humans. So thinking about other living beings is even a bigger test.
Yeah, I think that this is important to think about, even if it's so fragile to talk about collaboration with the virus in the times where people die from the virus. But I think the point is to really acknowledge other entities sharing the planet with us, and this concept of enemy and this notion of fighting and this idea of separation stems from Western sciences and microbiology, and has definitely shaped our relationship to the natural environment. And it's mirrored in our architectures, in our way of separating nature and culture in our thinking. And yeah, it also has deeply influenced how we separate each other as amongst humans, as you also pointed out. But I also think like this challenge of collaborating is the only way out. And collaboration means also, yeah, thinking in communities, not only in your local environment, but also thinking in planetary communities and thinking in the responsibilities of sharing resources in a way that we can create more equal conditions for each other. And as you mentioned, the homeless people, also, refugees and refugee camps are highly vulnerable for infection and contagion, as they also have such limited space they share with each other. And as you mentioned, the war zones, we also have to understand that bodies are more vulnerable when they lack of nutrition, when they're constantly under stress. And this has always been a key trigger then for not being able to fight an infection or to resist, let's say, to avoid the word fighting. Also, like in colonial times, infections were brought to indigenous communities that already have been suffering so much from the stress of colonization, where people have been killed and raped and taken their livelihood, and then were much easier to be infected, despite the fact that they have encountered diseases that they had never encountered over thousands of years before the first contact with another, how would you say, nationality or people that come from far away, that have a very different immune system. And I think we have to be careful about thinking with these new materialistic thoughts too one-sided, and it is a cacophony of knowledge, and it's a polyphony of perspectives. And I think the key is really thinking collaboration amongst each other, starting with your neighbors and then going beyond national borders, and then really also invite the thinking that infection is not caused by an entity, but also by infrastructures and by impacts in ecosystems and by the turbulences caused by monocultures. So ecosystems can't balance themselves, but then infection brings troubles to the ecosystems as well. Sorry, it got a bit blurry in the end, but I think you got what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Definitely. I guess we can continue this discussion for another 2 hours. But I think this is a good time to wrap up our conversation. And then I agree both how we have to just use the virus as a kind of a tool to multiply the narratives. This allows us to just give a challenge to this like a neoliberal infrastructures and capitalism. These lockdowns actually show that degrowth is necessary for the humanity, for the nature, for our forests, for our ecologies. But at the same time, it showed us that we need more solidarity, not the individualistic approach, and sharing those knowledges, memories, and then just creating stories for future through artistic practice is just necessary. Thank you for your contribution, for your collaboration, being you, and then just joining this conversation.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you both.
I look forward to the continuations.
Yeah. Thank you
Take
so
care,
much.
everyone. Stay safe.
Be safe. And then thank you so much for joining Naturkunde Berlin's Under the Viral Shadow online discussions. We have also more videos on our video channel, YouTube channel. Please visit. And then see you next time. Good night.
Good night.